Okay, so taphonomy is a form of research that allows us to create those relational and formal analogies that we talked about previously, where, right, so middle range theory exists as a way to connect the data, right, the actual physical artifacts that we pull out of the ground and the understanding that we have about those artifacts that we get from modern day people or that we infer from cultural stuff or whatever we think is going on, right? Trying to make some sort of uh, obvious, evidenced relationship between the stuff that's in the ground and what we think was happening culturally. So, taphonomy is one way of doing this. Taphonomy looks at the role of natural processes and the decomposition process of organic living things, especially animals, to an extent humans, although humans kind of get their own special treatment, which is something we're going to talk about in Module 3. But taphonomy lets us study the process of site formation, basically, in terms of the organic living things that were there. Right, so we talked about geoarc before, where geoarc is the site formation in terms of what actual soil is there, and what the rivers are like, and like how geologically did this site form, whereas taphonomy is more about how did this site form in terms of animal and human remains. So the example here is how large animal carcasses decompose on an African savanna, right? How long does it take the carcass to disarticulate? Which bones separate first? Which ones are carried away by carnivores and how far? And this is the same study or the same kind of research that gives us the body farm in University of Tennessee, Knoxville. They, if you haven't heard of it, it's a very famous research center for human decomposition. So if you donate your body to science, one of the things that could happen to you is being given to UTK, and UTK will put you out in their body farm, which is just a big open space that's kept as natural as possible. And then students who are doing research on human decomposition study what happens to you under given circumstances. It allows for forensic information for detectives and like investigators who are doing criminal investigations on about things that happen to human remains, and it provides information for most of the South based on the environment that's at Knoxville. Anyway, so that's one form of taphonomy as well. So we're going to talk about one that is not human. We're going to talk about bison bones and what happens to them when they decompose. So we're going to use an example of a bone bed. Bone beds occur when you have a large number of animals, often of the same species, and usually representing a single moment in time as a mass kill or a mass death. So we get this a lot in the prairies in the Midwest in the US, where you have a hunting method for the Native Americans that live there, right, where they would spook a herd of bison and basically chase them off a cliff, and all the bison would fall off the cliff, and then when they fell off the cliff they'd die, and it was an easy way and safer way of killing a whole lot of bison in a short period of time. And then all the bones and stuff would be left there. So that's usually how you get a bone bed, but not always, as we're going to discuss. So bone bed refers to any archaeological or paleontological site that has the remains of a large number of animals. So the bone bed we're going to be discussing is the Hudson-Mang bison kill in Nebraska. So there's about 500 bison and 21 spear points are found in an area that's 1,000 meters square. It's not huge, and there's a lot there. That picture in the previous slide was the bone bed. The radiocarbon date on it goes back to about 9,500 years, almost 10,000 years old, which is pretty impressive. And it was excavated by Larry Egenbrod in 1970s. It's a pretty famous site, and nowadays it's got a big building built over it. We're going to see a picture of it in a minute. It's got a big building built over, and you can go visit and see all the bones and like read about the interpretation and what it tells us about people that lived that long ago. And that's actually pretty old. Like humans probably settled the Americas somewhere around 15,000 years ago, and this is only about 5,000 years after that. So it's actually pretty cool. But that's the site. And then I'm going to talk about what Eggenbrod interpreted as, and then we're going to talk about the taphonomic perspective on the interpretation. So Eggenbrod was making conclusions, or like coming to conclusions or inferring information from the site that suggested the presence of humans, right, because there's a spear points, about a hunting strategy, which is chasing these bison into a specific space, the size of the group of the Native Americans and the group size of the bison, and then also some inferences about food storage, because you don't put 500 bison, like if you kill 500 bison, you gotta have a place to store all of that. And then there's also this pattern that he found in the skulls, where the tops of the skulls of the bison were frequently missing, and he was trying to explain what that was, and that has to do with the whole food storage thing. So he looked at all this data and he came up with a couple of conclusions. Those conclusions were Plains Indians drove these bisons over a cliff, even though there's no cliff directly nearby. They would have had to drag 500 of them to a processing area, which then becomes the bone bed. And I don't know if you've ever seen a bison, but they're really big. So dragging them after they're already dead from a cliff seems kind of lame. Why would you do that? But that was what that's what he decided, because at the time, like, that's all we could figure out for how you would kill 500 bison at once. So Plains Indians, he decided the Plains Indians, or Plains Native Americans, broke the bison skulls open to remove the brains and then used those as tanning hides, so which is a common practice. This is an indigenous practice, so that's a little bit of ethnoarchaeology. So he found a bunch of skulls where the tops of the skulls are broken off, assumed that Plains Native Americans were removing the brains from those skulls and used them to tan the hides of the bison, and that these ancient hunters were large, right? It was obviously a huge group if they're going to kill 500 bison, and excuse me, and then have some way to store, right, all of that food. That is a lot of food. So, I mean, you can get hundreds of pounds of food off of one bison. So they must have had some sort of sophisticated storage system. So, and based on traditional inferences or understanding of Native Americans, this is not a bad idea. He's using middle range theory here. He is coming up with formal analogies and relational analogies. The formal analogy relies on the similarity in the bison skull form, right, so the missing top of the skull, and the similarities between the site and documented butchering practices. So we know from modern day indigenous cultures and from historical references from post-contact times that this was a common practice to take the brains out of the skull and use it to help tan hides. And then the relational analogy of this is taking a known practice of Plains Indians and extrapolating it back in time to the ancestors, right? So we know the Plains Indians did this historically. They were probably doing it 10,000 years ago because, as we talked about previously, right, we rely on the principle of uniformitarianism for middle range theory. So Eggenbrod comes up with formal and relational analogies, and all of this makes a fair amount of sense to a point. Obviously, I'm skeptical about the dragging of the bison, but that's okay. I wasn't there. So he comes up with this idea, and for a long time that's been the traditional interpretation. So what comes next is a taphonomic perspective. Once we start understanding taphonomy a little bit, we start looking at, can a natural process create the same pattern? There are some questions here. If they were using the skull bones to make hides, right, to process hides and to butcher the skulls, then there should be cut marks on the bones. There should be some sort of stone tool cut mark on the bone. And we do not see that. So it is likely that a knife would have to cut in the bone. And then you would also expect to see like carnivore tooth marks appearing on the bones and like other damage to the bones besides just them being gone. And then the other thing that's weird is that the skeletal remains are in anatomical position, as if the bison died there and were buried undisturbed. So that's not what happens when you butcher an animal. When you butcher an animal, you're cutting it up into pieces and it gets disturbed and gets moved around a bunch. It doesn't just lay down and die and then that's it. So Todd Rapson, was two people, came up with a different hypothesis. Their hypothesis was that there was a summer storm that sparked a prairie fire and that drove the bison herd into the swale. And so this is the building site, right here. So the site is in this building, and then this is the swale. The swale refers to this dip here in the prairie. So the idea is that there may have been a prairie fire up on the surrounding hills around it, and the bison might have come into the swale for protection. And if the fire jumped the swale and was fully surrounding them, it easily could have asphyxiated the bison. And so they said that the spear points were probably discarded or lost after the bison died, decomposed, and became buried. So they argue that the spear points are part of the geoarc, basically, of the site, that they were placed there later, and that they maybe fell into some of the bones or moved through the soil into the bones. As we talked about, there's a number of different ways to move artifacts within soil. So they have this hypothesis remains to be tested. They don't really have access to do this, but this is what they propose, and they have kind of modeled a few things where it allows them to reconstruct how the taphonomic processes create the pattern of the incomplete crania specifically. So they're looking at the taphonomy, right, of these bison. What happens to them after they die? So what they found was that when the body collapses into a pile of bone, it continues to trap sediment until it's mostly buried. And then the skull's top would remain exposed. So the cranium then weathers, and the small bone fragments that flake off are blown away in the wind, which is something that bones do. When bones weather, they get very flaky and very chunky, and they, with enough sun, they become very unstable, and then they can blow away. So what this looks like is like this, right? So we've got, this is the original scenario, right? This is how the bison died. And then they get kind of partially buried over time, and the little bits that are left on top are exposed to the elements, and those elements get blown away or get taken away, and then you get continued deposition. So it looks like they took off the top of the skull, but in reality it's a natural process. So these are two different perspectives on the same site, right? And one uses a taphonomic perspective to find the link between the data that was in the ground and the modern cultural practices or the modern interpretation. So we have an idea of how the culture works, and then we have the data in the past. Taphonomy is used to create those analogies between the two, which makes it middle range theory. All right, I hope that made sense. I hope you understand taphonomy. Let me know if you have any questions. And then go ahead and move on to the next video when you are ready.